Hi, and welcome. As always, I'm Abby. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and here's my question for today. How can we create space for a new story of connection where previously there's only been disconnection? I ask a kind of broad question today because I think depending on where we're at in our lives and what our lives look like, the question of disconnection and connection could look different for everyone. But I imagine that it's something we all deal with in one way or another. Sometimes we have old stories that we still carry with us, and those stories create disconnection. But if we take the time to reflect, think about the kind of social worlds we want to create, and make new choices, I really believe that we could start telling new stories that create connection instead. Today we are joined by Terry and Bart to discuss their current work-in-progress film, What Now? Canaries in Camo. And really just to talk about the stories that we have around veterans, their stories and our relationship to them as civilians. Their film explores the realities and struggles of veterans as they re-enter civilian life after serving. It's a topic that is close to both Bart and Terry's hearts for different reasons, which we'll hear about today. And really the kind of beautiful thing that emerged from this conversation was using a real lens of connection to ask ourselves, why are we disconnected from each other? And what can we do to connect with each other? So let's start with Bart and Terry. Hello, Bart and Terry. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation today. I'm so glad to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm very, very grateful to be here.
It is great to be here, Abby, and good to see you. And thank you for taking some time to capture a little bit of this story.
Yes, I am excited to get to talk about the stories that you all are helping to tell and doing some really important work there. To start, I'd love it if both of you could introduce yourself, knowing the little bit of the direction of the conversation that we're going to get into today. You could share some stories or some context about who you are and what maybe we would want to know about you going into this conversation. Bart, would you like to start us off?
Sure, I can say a little bit about that. Basically, I am native of Fort Wayne, Indiana, and my grandfather was serving in the Army in World War I, and my dad served in the Army in World War II, and neither of them shared a lot of stories about that. So that set a little bit of a curiosity with me. There's a little mystery around of those things, and has been. And somehow as things progressed, I got interested in the United States Navy. And so I joined the Navy, went to the Naval Academy in 1974, and have served in the Navy for about 30 years after that in various capacities. And along the way, I ended up encountering the opportunity to come to Yountville, California, and work in at the time, it was one of the country's largest and oldest established veterans homes. And I got very interested in how that was founded, because it was created by veterans for veterans in a time when nothing like it existed. And it became something of a real community of veterans. And so fast forward a little bit, I got recalled to active duty. I went to Washington, D.C. in 2000. And ended up staying there longer than I thought I would because of what happened in September 2001. And as part of that, then coming back to the veterans home with the realization that we have another generation of veterans. And the Yountville home was founded by Civil War veterans, and it was largely populated by World War I and World War II veterans when I got there, and then the population shifted to Vietnam. But the question I had was, what are we going to do to support returning veterans from this very long and complex war at that time in Afghanistan and later Afghanistan and Iraq?
Yeah.
And how do we think about that? And so that was how I came to encounter Terry through a mutual friend of ours, Shirley Schoffel. Shirley, in her inquisitive manner, wanted to know, what is this veterans project that you were doing, because at that time we had created a small pilot project at the Yountville Veterans Home specifically geared to support returning Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, to try to intervene in what might be affecting them before they became long-term incapacitated in some ways by this. And so Terry and I have been talking for years about what is the story, how do you capture the story, who should tell the story, whose story is it to tell, and how do we make it as a call to action of some sort in the way of how do the rest of us respond to this. And I think that's where we should leave it for now. And that's where Terry and I have been collaborating for, I don't even know how many years. It's been quite a while.
I think the conversation started in about 2013, 2014, literally. So a decade. You could certainly say a decade. Yes, I'm a filmmaker, and actually Shirley Schaufel was a client of mine. She came to me with a film that she wanted to make. She was a fabulous woman and did a lot of exhibitions, but she had social commentary or some social message was always part of her museum exhibition work. And she came to me with the idea of making a film about Native American basketry. It was cradle baskets specifically. And the reason she was doing cradle baskets was because they were one of the baskets that were still somewhat in use. People actually made cradle baskets and they actually used them. So she was doing a museum exhibition for the Marin Museum of the American Indian that would travel around the country. And she wanted a short documentary about the baskets, about the use of the baskets, the tradition, and about some of the basket makers. So I was fortunate enough to do that job for her and made a film called Precious Cargo, which went out with her exhibit all around the country. I don't even know, it may still be being exhibited in various places. But it was about a 25-minute piece. It was narrated by Peter Coyote, who actually got me involved in that project. They had him involved first. So that was how I met Shirley. And then Shirley came to me with the idea of doing a film on veterans' return. And it was, at the time, I think it was called Warrior's Journey. And it was an effort to make the difficulty of veterans returning from active duty, from whatever their duty was really, back into society. And there was not a very, very specific focus. It was quite a general idea. And at that point, Shirley introduced me to Bart. And I have to say, this was not a subject of mine. I did not know anything really about this issue, this problem. My father, as you know from the film As If They Were Angels, my father was in World War II. I had quite a strong connection to that. But I had also been against the war in Vietnam and had been, involved in the anti-war movement at that time. So I was just, obviously, I had learned a lot of lessons from that, were very different in over the years, but I didn't know much about veterans. And in fact, I didn't know any veterans really. And so my first reaction to this was, do we even know veterans? I mean, obviously some people do, a lot of people do, but my community, most of the people who I know, don't even know any veterans. It's such a small population relatively that serves that we're not even connected. And that lack of connection is what really got me engaged in this subject. I realized that lack of connection was deadly to returning veterans, and it was inauthentic and irresponsible of civilians. So that's really when this whole idea of doing a film on this subject came to being, was just when I realized what this is about and how big it is. It's big.
Yeah.
And if we really take it on and if we really deal with it, it could be a fabulously positive change, not just for veterans, of course, also for veterans, but also for civilians and for our somewhat atomized society.
Yeah, well, thank you both. That's a great introduction. And of course, I'll go ahead and name that the project you're talking about now is What Now? And I believe, is there a subtitle to that as well?
There is a subtitle. It's all a working title at this
Sure.
point.
Okay, yes.
The subtitle is Canaries in Camo, because our veterans are, you could say they represent the canary in the coal mine. They're suffering from something that is painfully connected to isolation, lack of connection, and the Surgeon General recently came out with a quote saying, "We are a nation of isolation and disconnection, and it's making us sick." Well, it's been like that for veterans for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
So, metaphorically speaking, there is that idea that they have been experiencing this for a long time, like the canary in the coal mine, prefacing something that is a wider and larger problem as well. But working titles are working titles.
Working titles. Yes. All a work in progress. We'll remember that. What else do you want to say about where the project's at right now?
Well, we do have what we call a sample or an introduction. It gets viewed as a trailer, but it's not really, because the film is not completed. This is not a pull from a completed film, as most trailers are. This is a piece that I started putting together and working with Bart on a piece of material that we had shot together. And I don't know if you want me to go into that, but one of the first things when we were still kind of in the development phase, Bart was hosting, facilitating. There were 3 veteran facilitators. Is that the right word, Bart?
That would be accurate. We had 3 of us, and they were from different disciplines. I basically come from the Adlerian psychology side, and even the social systems and communication side, and the CMM reference, coordinated management of meaning, sort of comes into it here. And then the other 2 were representing clinical psychology. Dr. Howard Levine, who also was a Navy doctor at one point in his career, and then Steve Torgeson, who was an Air Force chaplain. So we had that kind of the spiritual, psychological, communication dimension of facilitating a veterans retreat, and it was being hosted by a holistic retreat center in New York, in Rhinebeck, New York, called the Omega Institute. And they're rooted in Jungian psychology and other things, but basically their retreats are putting people in nature, reconnecting to the natural environment, doing healing practices like yoga, tai chi, mindfulness meditation, and even in the dining room, it's more of a vegan, very health conscious type of menu. So you wonder, how are a bunch of veterans going to fit in that environment? And it turned out that it attracted some veteran participants who were deeply reflective, who had been thinking about things but hadn't quite figured where to go next. And so we did these retreats 4 years in a row. And over time, it's like a leaven, I would say leaven in a bowl of sourdough, is each year a different group would come, but there would be a few from the previous year who had some experience And they really, I wouldn't say that we did this intentionally as facilitators, but the group found its own sense of connection over these years. And by the time we had the opportunity to have Terry come in with her film crew, they were open enough to let that be a part of their week together and to be very open with us and just open in general as they had been with each other in sharing their own experiences. And they had also found some ways to open up and connect with other groups who were on retreat at the Omega Center at the same time, which was not something that we had anticipated at all. As a matter of fact, if we had a very strict mental health oversight of that project, it wouldn't have happened, because that's one of the things that the conventional wisdom says about how do you treat veterans. Well, they have their own experience. They don't want to talk to people that aren't part of that experience. And so we keep them kind of firewalled off. And we also clamp down with the strictest form of confidentiality and having them talk about things that might be difficult for them, and they might be difficult at other levels too. And they broke through all of those things. And we were very fortunate to be able to have Terry and her group with them when they did that.
That was really the first. I took just myself and a sound person, a cinematographer that I had worked with for many, many years. And so it was just the three of us, and we went up for what was a 5-day retreat. Now, prior to this, I have to say, and partly through Bart, I had met with some extraordinary veterans. I had met with a gentleman up near where I live, Ernie Bergman, who has for years gone into high schools to talk about recruitment and talk about signing up, basically, and what the real experience is like. Recruiters go into high schools all the time, and he wasn't in any way trying to get kids not to enlist, but he was trying to give a broader story, a wider story, and give them opportunities to ask questions that they would get experienced response to based on where they were coming from. And so I had spoken with him. He was an extraordinary help in terms of getting myself oriented to what this is all about. And then I also spoke with an amazing veteran named Paul Chappell, who was a West Point graduate and served as a captain in the military, and came out with a lot of his own difficult experience and wrote a number of books that were really about waging peace and about using military discipline and military, knowledge to actually work at keeping peace, making peace, living in peace. And so I had, pieces of this. When I went into this retreat, I think there were, including the facilitators, I think there were 19 veterans. They were from all the wars, from Vietnam to Operation Iraqi Freedom. And I have to tell you, just to be honest about how uninformed I think we are, I certainly am, I didn't know what Operation Iraqi Freedom was. The veterans were talking about OIF, and I'm sitting there pretending I know what they're talking about, because I really didn't until somebody said Operation Iraqi Freedom. So the deal I made with them was we would be like flies on the wall. I did not want to interfere in what their process was and what they were there to do. They weren't there to be a part of this film. They were there for reasons that were very highly motivational to them. And so we didn't want to interfere with that in any way. And I think we didn't interfere. They did all give us permission to go ahead and shoot and make the film. So I think one of the most, if I had to say what was the most impactful thing from that experience, I would say the amount of times I heard the word purpose. I was stunned by how much they were suffering from a lack of purpose.
Interesting.
And that they had lost the sense of purpose that they had whatever they had done, their experiences that had made so much of life afterwards difficult, those were true and those were real. But what became clear was that purpose and service were very important to them. And I'm looking at my own culture, my own society, which you don't hear the word purpose that often. You don't hear the word service that often. So right away, it was like, wow, this is, return in some ways, obviously related to their service in war, but also return just simply looking at a culture that is so different, that is so, as I said, atomized, so oriented around individual success, as if individual success is really what it's about. I mean, I could argue with you that some of the pay that goes to executives in this country, you'd think they did it by themselves. They don't do it by themselves. None of us do it by ourselves, really. And the extent to which that becomes the important thing, that sense of I'm a success, I did it by myself, it's largely a myth.
Yeah.
This was a huge wake-up call for me. They were so authentic and so just looking for something that would give them a way back in. I mean, one of the veterans, a guy named Nathan, said, he was so very articulate, so many of them are, said, you want to come home. You want to come home and be the person you were when you left. You want to come home to the family you left, but you can't. You are no longer the person you were when you left. Your family is no longer the family you left. In a way, you can't come home again. There is a difference, and we have to be able to recognize that and accommodate for that as a civilian culture, as a society. Their families certainly have to do that, and that's hard enough. We all have to do that, and we all have to participate in doing that. And that would be transformative for everybody.
Yeah, even, just me having been able to watch the sample that you have before this conversation, what I was struck by was how open and, like you said, articulate too all of these veterans were, because like Bart was alluding to, kind of the go-to is isolation, or we have this kind of idea that these people who have been through such a different experience than, myself as a civilian, what could you possibly relate on? Or just you're not creating the space for those stories to be told. But that, again, is one thing that's just constructed and isn't the way that it has to be, and is clearly not working for us to be so isolated. But yeah, I was struck by the openness and the authenticity that they were offering. And that clearly had to do with the space that they were being given, which is not usually given. And so I think that that's so much of what this is about. And not to put words in your mouth, but I'm kind of, already thinking about the answer to what does this project say a better social world looks like? And I'd be curious to hear more about your thoughts on that. But really what I'm thinking that it gets distilled down to is connection.
That's exactly what I would say too. I mean, to kind of put it fully, I feel like we're out of balance. Our society is out of balance. And there are a lot of factors to coming back into balance, but mostly, or you think of it as out of balance or broken, the answer is connection. It really is. And I think that when we talk about what does it look like, part of what you responded to something when we were on email was the desire to look away. And we have an urge when we see and hear painful. I mean, there's the train wreck urge, which is why so much of Hollywood is successful. You want to see the train wreck. But there's also a lot of other sides of Hollywood, and also of how connection can happen and what difference it can make. And I think that looking away from pain, looking away from the things that are difficult to hear and difficult to see, means that we don't hear those voices and we don't see those faces. And years ago, I made a documentary, probably in the early 90s, a documentary short called I Wish I Were a Princess. And it was a 14-minute piece of inner city kids telling their stories in their own words. And they were heartbreaking stories. They were stories about homelessness, being in a shelter because so many of your relatives had passed, violence, seeing violence, drug dealing, seeing your parents do drugs. These kids were a 4-year-old talking about abuse, domestic violence in the home. They were so aware of how wrong it was, and how and so authentic about how painful it was, that on the one hand, it was hard to watch, and you do want to not know in a way. On the other hand, you see them and you hear them and you pay attention to them and you realize who these people are. And if these kids could grow up to be the potential that they have, that you're seeing in their faces, that you're hearing in their stories and in their emotional and intellectual connections to what they're saying at such a young age, you instead of that urge to look away, there's like, reach out, connect. And if as a society, we could go more in that direction with reach out and connect instead of the looking away, and recognize that what we're seeing is human potential. We're seeing human possibility. And humanity in all of this is connection, is a big part of it. Being into our humanity, getting back there in some way. I mean, it sounds so trite and la-di-da, but it's really possible. I used to tell my daughter when she was little, it was one of the ways I could exemplify something very simple. But, we've all seen people grab a parking space. You can see somebody's waiting for that space. They're about to get that space. And some jerk comes along and zips into the parking space. And they get out of their car, they try not to look at you, and they go about their business, right? And I used to say to Sasha, if they knew that person, if that person who was waiting for that space was a neighbor or a parent of a kid they knew from school, or they wouldn't do that. They're doing it because it's a stranger. And as simplistic as that is, it's the story in a way.
Yeah.
So, I would love to tell you that since early 90s, when I made I Wish I Were a Princess, that so much has changed. But that video could be made today. It's a 14-minute piece. It could be made today and it would feel like today. So I don't know. I think one of the things about veterans, and I think that one of the things that can be different about this film, hopefully we're in a state as a society where we're a little bit more alarmed at ourselves. That would be helpful. If that motivated people to not look away. I also think that it is impossible to deny our own responsibility. Veterans are out there doing a job that whether we're against the wars or in favor of the wars or whatever our personal individual positions are, they're working for us. We're paying them. They're doing a job that we are paying them to do. There is no better definition than of responsibility than that. And yet we act as if we owe them nothing. We have no reason to be informed, no need to be informed. And that's just not true. It's absolutely not true on any level. One of the things that we're really working hard to make the film exemplify is where those connections work, where they're made, where veterans and civilians come together, how and where, and all the various ways that it works.
One of the things I was thinking about when Terry was explaining that is where the CMM connection comes into this project in a very real way, because it's if you look at the ways that CMM is a departure from the traditional communication model. The transmission of information. What do we focus on in those models? The information. We focus on the details of that are being passed around. We don't look so much at the process of how they're being shared, the connections that enable them to be shared, and then most importantly, the co-creation, back and forthness of making meaning from those stories as we're looking at them from a broader perspective than just the one party. So that is one thing. CMM is seeing how we construct our social worlds and communication. And we hope that the film allows people to see we are all constructing this together. Some people are experiencing it in a sharper way, a less healthy way, and we need to understand how we all get better from that. And I think that brings the other CMM concept in here, which was cosmopolitan communication. And we've talked with Arthur Jensen in particular about his Cosmopolis 2045 project. How do we envision a better social world in the year 2045, and what's different about it if we are using more of a CMM perspective? And what the Cosmopolis perspective is based on the social constructing of the world as a real and participative process. And second, it realizes that everybody is going to be different and yet connected in that process. So the cosmopolitan model looks at how communication and how culture is ethnocentric in some ways, and that it takes real effort to cross those boundaries. And that's, I think, what veterans have been struggling with, or we've been struggling with in this country to create space for veterans to come back, is that we don't have a lot of those bridging mechanisms, which, in the cosmopolitan model, we would call those coordinating pieces. So in other words, the cultures don't line up. So there has to be a way to coordinate across that. And then there's this principle of emergence, which is if you create those bridges, then something better will emerge from that, because we will collectively be able to see that there is something we should learn, we should be differently as a result of that shared awareness. So that's one of the things we haven't really have. So when Terry says, we really have to understand as a society how to take responsibility for some of this, I think that moves us all out into a broader perspective of ownership of the process.
Yeah, that feels really important. And the other CMM-ish idea that I've been thinking about as the two of you have been talking is kind of this dichotomy between our told stories and our untold stories, and that the stories are shaping us, whether they're told or untold. And this feels like a big example of the way that untold stories shape us. And Terry, to get back to what you were talking about, it's this like shared humanity. And that's what really can come out when we create the space for these previously untold stories to be told. And for the tellers of those stories, the people who lived those stories, to feel safe to do so. Is that, again, even in the, short 30 minutes that I got to watch of your project, I was immediately struck by, like I said, the openness and also the humanity of these people. And to be able to hear their stories is humanizing. And it is the first bid for connection, not disconnection. And I think that, again, people might have the instinct to look away, turn away, to not engage, and to continue with disconnection because maybe they think once they hear these stories, it'll feel more disconnecting because it's not anything they've personally experienced. And again, we can talk about distinct groups of people as citizens and veterans, but we can just say, all of these humans, and what does the connection between all of these humans look like? And that's really the core of it from my understanding.
And I also think that what Bart touched on earlier and what you also touched on, that there is an aspect of the veteran side of the system that does also isolate veterans in an effort to protect them, in an effort to give them good services and, obviously good medical care, all of this system that focused specifically on veterans. It's very, very important. But at the same time, it doesn't really leave a lot of room for this connection that we're talking about. And I also think it does emphasize, and I think civilian ignorance is part of this as well, obviously, that it is hard for veterans to tell their stories. It's frightening in a way because you never know what somebody's going to come back and say. I mean, it's a little bit scary for veterans to open to civilians in conversation. They very often get a thank you for your service, but it doesn't go on from there. People don't ask about what that service was. How are you doing now? In any way, connecting to a human being, the way, even with a networking approach, right? We all network like crazy with each other. So it's just, there's an awkwardness that is a result of a lack of connection. And I think that's a little bit built in, and I think it was built by us, and we can change it.
Okay, that is all for part 1 of our conversation with Bart and Terry, but you can join the 3 of us next Monday for part 2, where we'll wrap up this conversation, continue talking about Bart and Terry's experiences, and consider some of the new stories that we'd like to tell around veterans and our relationship to them and what it looks like to support veterans and create a more connected community together. In the meantime, between now and next week's conversation, I'd like to point you to the questions that I have listed at the top of the show notes as some prompts for reflection this week. Those questions are: how can we better support veterans and make space to hear their stories? What are the stories we have around war and those who serve? How do these stories keep us isolated and disconnected? And how do we overcome the impulse to look away from painful realities and instead create opportunities for connection to our own and others' humanity? I hope these are good next turns, things to be thinking about in your own life to keep this conversation alive between now and next week's conversation. As always, I'm supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is just one of many initiatives that is part of creating that better social world that we are working towards. You can check out more about all the other CMM Institute initiatives in the show notes below. I have some links there for you to get connected. Finally, some podcast-specific next turns I'd like to offer you are to share this episode with someone you'd like to invite into the conversation. I've said it before and I'll say it again that my hope for this podcast is to be one big invitation into a conversation that's bigger than us, to get us and the people in our lives thinking about the kind of social worlds we want to create and to empower us to actually believe that we are active participants in creating them. Another way to stay connected is to reach out to me. You can do that through email, through the website, through Instagram and YouTube, all of which are linked in the show notes. I love to be in dialogue with you, so please reach out. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abby, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told. Bye.